We're going to get started in just a second, everyone. Okay, good evening and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. Here tonight with Barbara Demick in conversation with Edward Wong about her new book, Eat the Buddha. Before we get started, I just have two quick housekeeping notes for everyone. The first is that we encourage everyone to purchase the book, and there is a link in the chat which I have just posted. If you click on that, you can purchase the book from politicsandprose.com. It's a great way to support our author and also to support your local independent bookstore. Secondly, the latter portion of tonight's event will be dedicated to your questions, and we do encourage everyone to ask a question. The way you do that is to click on the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you can ask a question, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. So with that out of the way, it is my honor to introduce Barbara Demick to Politics and Prose Live. She is the author of Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and National Books Critics Circle Award, and the winner of the Samuel Johnson Prize in the United Kingdom. She's also the author of Lagavulin Street, Life and Death in a Sarajevo Neighborhood. Demick is also a staff writer for the Los Angeles Times and a contributor to the New Yorker. She was also recently a press fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. In her new book, Eat the Buddha, she tells the story of a Tibetan town perched 11,000 feet above sea level that is one of the most difficult places in all of China for foreigners to visit. Demick reveals what it's like to really be a Tibetan in the 21st century, trying to preserve one's culture, faith, and language against the depredations of a seemingly unstoppable, technologically all-seeing superpower. Tonight, Demick will be in conversation with Edward Wong, a diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times who reports on foreign policy. So here are Barbara and Edward.
Hi, thanks a lot for that introduction. It's good to see you again, Barbara. It's been a while since we've seen each other in person.
Yeah, just a full disclosure, Ed and I worked together in Beijing for some years, he with the New York Times and me with the LA Times. And I'm no longer with the LA Times, by the way. I'm trying to be a full-time author, but
right.
Anyway,
and we appreciate you doing that. We appreciate you doing that since we get great books from that mission of yours. So speaking of Beijing, I thought a good place to start might be just for you to tell us a little bit about, your first encounters with both Tibet in your imagination, but then also with the practicalities of reporting on Tibet during the events that unfolded there when you soon after you arrived in Beijing as a correspondent for the LA Times. I think you first arrived in Beijing in 2007, if I'm not mistaken. And there was news that came out of the Tibetan plateau that got headlines around the world soon afterwards. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about about what Tibet represented to you in your mind before your arrival in China, and then sort of how you first started getting involved with reporting on it.
Thanks very much, Ed. Yeah, we arrived in China about the same time, and a few months before the 2008 Olympics in March of 2008, the largest protests against Chinese rule broke out in Lhasa and then spread throughout the Tibetan plateau. And I went racing out to cover them along with a lot of my colleagues. And that was really my first experience writing about Tibet. I was not, sort of a lifelong wannabe Tibetologist. I hadn't spent a lot of time reading about Tibet. I'm not a Buddhist. I was, I think, attracted by the mysteriousness of the place. And by the people, really wanting to understand the people. So I went out in late March, early April 2008, and I just kept traveling to Tibet. It was, to me, the most interesting part of China. And I was a newcomer, not a sinologist. I shouldn't say this now, but I had really wanted the Paris bureau, and I got Beijing instead. So I was a little bit of a newcomer, and I didn't know much, but I felt like everybody else seemed to speak much better Chinese than me and know much more. but nobody I knew really knew that much about Tibet. And so I think that's just why I latched onto it. And I mean, I've said this before, but journalists are very contrarian creatures. And if you tell us we're not supposed to go someplace or make it hard for us to go, we'll of course want to go. And I was really interested in what it was the Chinese government didn't want us to see. Why it was so hidden from the Foreign Press Corps.
In your book, it doesn't try and encompass all of Tibet. What you do is you decided to focus on a very specific part of the Tibetan plateau, a place called Naba. And I was wondering what made you decide to choose to focus on that. I mean, this isn't sort of a book where it's a recollection of your reporting across, Tibet during your time there, but more you decide to undertake this very intense research and reporting experience and focus just on one place and the people there over a long period of time. And so why choose this place in particular?
I mean, I've always worked with microcosms, and my previous books also took a smaller place to see how you could tell the story of the larger through this place. My first book, Ngaba Street, was about one street in Sarajevo. My book about North Korea focused on the city of Chongjin. And so I knew I had to pick a place, somewhere. And, as the years went on, Naba became the most obvious place to pick because the Selfimmolations started there in 2011. It had some of the most serious protests in 2008. It was clearly the engine of Tibetan unrest. And, I was curious. And I had also kind of coincidentally stumbled across some writings about the history of Naba, about the local kings who ruled, about its role in the Long March. There were conflicts with the Chinese Communist Party going back to the 1930s. And I don't know, it was just, I had to pick some place and I picked that place.
Right. How do you, for some people in the audience, they might not be familiar with sort of the geography of Tibet and its relationship to China. The geography and topography are an essential part of understanding the area, its history, and also the daily lives of its people. So can you situate us on the Tibetan plateau? Tell us where Naba is and how you would get there and what the challenges of getting there to report are.
Sure. There's lots of different definitions of Tibet. I mean, what the Chinese government considers Tibet is the Tibet Autonomous Region, and that's really central and western Tibet. And that's less than half of the Tibetan plateau and slightly less than half of the population. So there's all these parts of Tibetan plateau that look like Tibet that are mostly populated by Tibetans in Sichuan, Gansu, Qinghai, Yunnan provinces. Naba is in Sichuan province, and to get there, you fly or take a train to Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan, and it's a very modern city with malls and neon and lots of traffic and lots of glitz. And then you start driving and you start climbing, and it usually takes about 10 hours or so to get there. And you climb through these gorges and switchbacks, and it's very wet, and it's almost like a temperate rainforest. It's sort of panda country, and then the sky bursts open, and when you reach Tibet, you're there because you have this big sky and rolling hills, and it's the Tibetan plateau is very otherworldly, and you've arrived. And I mentioned that this is a very tricky thing. It's you're required to have a special permit to go to the Tibet Autonomous Region, to go to Lhasa. And it's not that hard. A lot of tourists go. Lots of my friends relatives have been to Lhasa. These parts of eastern Tibet are really in theory open. There's nothing to prevent us from going. And in fact, you know, as a journalist, sometimes I would call and say, are we allowed to go here or there? And in Beijing, they would always say yes. But when you get there, there'd be checkpoints and you'd be, you know, sent back under, you know, some excuse for your own safety. But, you know, with Naba, I mean, I went several times. I didn't sneak in. It was, you know, perfectly legal for me to go. And I mean, it's something I would just emphasize, because we as journalists accredited by the Chinese government had a lot of rules we needed to follow.
Right. Yeah, and I'll say that I've been to some of those regions myself, and under perfectly legal auspices, even if the foreign ministry wanted to have a conversation with me afterwards about the actual substance of the stories.
Yeah.
And then, but of course, that's the geography that we're talking about. Your book is about people. You paint these very compelling portraits of several characters who span the history of the era in Tibet when the Chinese army and the Communist Party had occupied it and then started governing it, starting from the late 50s onward up to today. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the people you decided to focus on and why them in particular?
Yeah, well, I mean, the book opens with the story of a princess, and it's a little bit of a fairy tale, but that part of Tibet was, you know, governed by local kings and chieftains. And this girl, she was a girl when the book begins in 1958, was 7 years old. And the, you know, one day, basically the Red Army came and kicked her out of the palace. These areas were, you know, nominally part of China for a long time, but they had not really been governed by China. And the Chinese just, you know, came in and uprooted everything, you know, kicked out the local rulers, confiscated homes, confiscated animals, closed the monasteries, kicked out the monks. You know, that all happened in 1958 in this part of Eastern Tibet. And so the opening of the book is really telling the story from a little girl's point of view. And she was not a typical Tibetan girl, she was a princess, but she, you know, this was her whole world, and her father was king as far as she knew. And there are other people in the book who were her contemporaries who were also children at that time. And they didn't really think of themselves as being part of Tibet. This was, again, you know, their whole world, and their lifestyle was totally something apart.
Right. Where did you first hear about the story of Ganpo and her family? And then where do you meet her, and where do you do most of the interviews with her?
I met her in Dharamsala, northern India, which is the home of the exiled Dalai Lama. And somebody in the Tibetan parliament said, you know, we have this woman here who was like, you know, she was a young woman who left Naba. She's a princess. Her father was the last king. Would you like to meet her? And I was like, yeah, sure. And she was, he kind of dragged her into a conference room to meet me. And she was, you know, very shy and didn't really want to talk, but she was polite. And you know, we sort of exchanged contacts, but she didn't really agree to an interview. And I went one day with a translator to her home. I just arrived unannounced. And, you know, once we started, she had a lot of tales to tell. I mean, she was really part of this forgotten history of Tibet. And over the course of reporting the book, she became a bigger and bigger part. She and her family members started giving me documents and photos and, you know, histories of this area, which had been, you know, very prosperous in the 20s, 30s, 40s. The kings of Naba were very business minded, And it was a major trading route, not the Silk Road, because it's south of the Silk Road, but a very prosperous place. And Naba was famous for its entrepreneurs. And that happened again in the 80s and 90s when China opened up. The Tibetans became, great beneficiaries of the reform and opening. They were trading from southern China, from the manufacturing hubs, and into Nepal and India. And then that was sort of shut down in the 90s, going into 2000 and up to the Olympics. The Chinese government started imposing more travel regulations, making it very difficult for Tibetans to get passports, making it very difficult for Tibetans to even travel around the plateau. And that, I think, was one of the engines of the unrest.
And when the book, the first story in the book is Ganpo's story, and it's set in 1958 when she's a child. Like, you're really bringing the reader into what her childhood was like in these, like, at the beginning of sort of like the era of the Chinese occupation of Tibet in that first decade. How do you get those details out of her or out of her family members, and what are the challenges in sort of getting these rich details to tell a narrative personal history when that history goes so far back, goes decades back?
It's really interesting when you're doing narrative nonfiction. It's a very tough form. I think maybe the hardest, because as a narrative, it has to be like a novel. You need a lot of detail to keep the reader, moving on. But then, because it's nonfiction, it has to be true. So you can't make up the detail. And I found that I'm sort of captive to what the interview subjects remember, and memory is very interesting. There are some things people don't remember. They don't remember years. They may not remember what they wore. But Ganpo had some very, very specific memories. I mean, she remembered the night that the Red Army came to kick her out of the palace. She was actually on her way home from a funeral with her mother on horseback. And she remembers very clearly, the horses approaching her palace and smelling smoke. And the smoke was from bonfires basically lit by the Red Army, to keep warm. And she remembers those smells very clearly. And she remembers being told that she had to pack her bags. And she remembers, specific toys that she left behind. She remembers that she had an orange apple that was not clear whether it was plastic or ceramic, but you unfolded it and there was a smaller piece of fruit inside, like a nesting doll. And she said later, when she was an adult, she looked all over to try to find another one. Right. And often editors will ask, something else. Well, what did she eat on this occasion? What was the weather? And she won't remember, but other things people will remember. And she was a very compelling storyteller. And I interviewed other members of her family as well. And the family had compiled a bit of an oral history. And so, I managed to piece it together.
And there's also, for example, there's a monk who plays a large role in your book. I believe you met him in Dharamsala. Can you tell us a little bit more about him, for example?
Yes. His name is Dong Tuk. It's his nickname. It means basically wild baby yak. And he, he was also, a lot of this book is told from children's points of view, but he was a child growing up in this village, Merima, that figures very prominently in the book. And he was like a little Tibetan boy who didn't know how to ride a horse, had bad eyesight, wasn't very sporty, but he liked to read. He was kind of an intellectual. And so his mother enrolled him in the monastery, Kirti Monastery, and because that's where you went to get an education. And he tells the story really from a child's point of view, watching these protests begin and he lost several people close to him through self-immolation. Watching this sort of explosion of rage against the Chinese system, which he didn't really participate in directly. He had absolutely no intention of self-immolating. But he, I think, was a witness in a quite honest way.
Right, and Kirti Monastery, is one of these central institutions in Naba. Can you tell us a little bit more about that monastery and sort of the role that it's played in recent years in what's been happening?
Yeah, Kirti became really famous in 2011 when the self-immolations began in a big way. But even before that, it was often figuring at the center of some of the unrest. And in a way, it was because it was like, it was like a university. It's hard to explain this to Americans. It's like, Columbia University in the 60s or Berkeley. It was a place with a lot of, young, well-educated Tibetans, and they became more, aware of their history and of some of the trauma that had been suffered by their ancestors. And so, and Kirti was also targeted by the party for what they called patriotic education. That started, I think, back in '98 in Naba. It started earlier in Lhasa, but monks were brought in, and they had to denounce the Dalai Lama and were required to do this kind of training that they thought was very provocative. And it just built over time. The patriotic education, the heavy police presence, the demonstrations in 2008, which were all over the Tibetan plateau, outside of Lhasa. They were the largest in Naba. And then the self-immolations began. And things happen in one place and they catch on. I mean, it's more than a third of the self-immolations took place in Naba or involved Naba people. And a disproportionate number of them were not only from Naba, but they were from Merima. Merima is a village that's part of Naba. And it was this village where the king and this princess, they were part of something called the Mei Dynasty. And the village was named for the Mei Dynasty. And they kept, the royal family kept their animals there, and they also kept their military there. So a lot of the people in Merima were the children and grandchildren of Tibetan warriors who had fought communists in the 1930s and again in the 1950s. And I think there was, something that we'll call like generational trauma, but there was these trauma in the families, and these children, as they grew up, would hear stories about starvation and about the persecution of the monks and about some of the violence. And that became, part of their psyche.
Right, and even though you talk about the self-immolations, we're talking a lot about that now. I realize it's only a small part of the book. What were some surprising things you found in terms of when you interview your subjects and looked into their lives about the ways they interacted, or they or their family members interacted with the Chinese Communist Party or with the Chinese authorities in Naba? There's a lot of sort of complex interactions that take place between Tibetans and the party, and what were some of the more surprising things you found?
It was interesting to me that many of the Tibetans I interviewed considered themselves socialists and were somewhat supportive of, aspects of party rule. This was true of Ganpo, who, I haven't told her whole story, but she goes on and is educated in Chinese schools, has a very traditional kind of socialist upbringing, reads Mao's Little Red Book. She marries a Chinese man. So many of these Tibetans felt that somehow at its core, the Chinese Communist Party promised them, equality and freedom of religion. And, some of the messages about distribution of wealth kind of, mesh nicely with Buddhism. So I think I was surprised that they had, complicated and often somewhat contradictory feelings towards the Communist Party. It wasn't all anti.
Mm-hmm.
And quite a few of the people who I met were, married to somebody Chinese or had a family member who was married to somebody Chinese, and there were prejudices and dislikes, but it wasn't exactly like ethnic warfare.
Right. And you mentioned that you did some of your reporting in Dharamsala where you interviewed several of these characters who appear prominently in your book. What's the relationship of, when you've been to Naba, what's the relationship of people there with Tibetans in exile or with the government in exile in Dharamsala, and then in particular with the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Tibetans?
It's interesting. A lot of Tibetans who went to Dharamsala weren't really, political exiles. I mean, they often went to get an education. The Tibetan exile government and some of the Western NGOs run a network of schools, that cater to the Tibetan exile community. And often people went to India, they wanted to, maybe see the Dalai Lama. That's like making the Hajj. Is that something else people should? They wanted to get a blessing from the Dalai Lama. They wanted to get an education, learn English, learn Tibetan, sometimes learn Chinese. A lot of these schools teach Chinese. And, they weren't leaving because they hated China. And I think a lot of them wanted to go back to China or go back to Tibet, and then found that they were unable because they were sort of, pegged as dissidents and exiles. But India is very special to Tibetan Buddhists, and most of them would like to go to India, and then they get, trapped in this whole cycle because they might want to go to India, go to a prayer service, maybe see the Taj Mahal, but they can't get a passport. So, those passports are just a really big deal for Tibetans. And so then they end up sneaking across the border and then they can't get back. But it's again, a very complicated relationship. And I found that when I was in Dharamsala, a lot of the Tibetans there, there were things they missed about China. And Naba is in Sichuan. So whenever we were going out to dinner, they were like, I'm tired of Indian food. Let's go have Chinese food. It's like we'll get some spicy Sichuan food.
Mm-hmm. And then how much of your research and reporting for this book took place in sort of the communities in Dharamsala or in Kathmandu, for example, and how much of it took place in Naba itself? I ask this because I wonder how much there was in parallel with your method of reporting for Nothing to Envy, the book on North Korea, where a lot of the interviews took place outside the actual location you were writing about.
That's a very good question. For people who are not familiar, Nothing to Envy, which is about this city, Xinjiang in North Korea. I've never been to that city. I wrote like a whole book about it, but it was almost impossible for any foreigner to visit Xinjiang. And so I went to Pyongyang a couple of times. I went to a few other parts of North Korea, but that book was reconstructed with interviews from people who had left Xinjiang. And the reason I did that was that if I wrote about a place that I had been, the fact that a foreigner could go there like Pyongyang meant that it wasn't representative of North Korea. Pyongyang is a showcase capital. The people are better dressed, better fed. so that's not the real North Korea. I had to pick a place that I couldn't go. This was somewhat different. I spent a bit of time in Naba. I think one trip I was there about 5 days. It's a little bit tricky. I mean, I went in and out. I didn't sleep in Naba because you can't check into a hotel there as a foreigner.
Mm-hmm.
But I did, I walked around Kirti Monastery. I did the Kora. I talked to people in the villages. I didn't walk around the center of town because I would have been picked up immediately. And I did a lot of other interviews in other parts of Tibet, in Golog, which is just to the west, which is a little bit less restricted. I did some interviews in Chengdu. The reason I ended up focusing, though, mostly on people, and some of the people in this book are still in Tibet, but the reason I ended up focusing on people in Dharamsala was I needed, for the kind of reporting I do, I need like long interviews. I mean, all of those, the main people in this book were interviewed 6, 7, 8 times, and they have to be interviewed by, with a very good translator. In Naba, they speak sort of a dialect of Tibetan. So you need a good translator who also speaks English. You can't do narrative nonfiction without a lot of access to people. And, I tried to pick people who were not, really activists, who, weren't, coming down with a, just like a propaganda message. I wanted to get people who had more nuanced views. And I mean, Tibetans, like everybody else, there's a lot of different points of view. And, as with the other book, I interviewed many, many more people than were actually in the book. And there were some people I interviewed who were quite important, but they weren't in the book for various reasons.
I would just want to start taking some questions from the audience because I see some good questions coming across the screen here. One, Jane here asks, what's the difference between life in the in central Tibet, the Tibet Autonomous Region, which you mentioned earlier, and Naba, where the place you were writing about?
My sense is, and actually I was in Lhasa in 2017 as a tourist, so I didn't write about it because that wouldn't have been permitted. But my sense is that it's quite a bit more controlled in the Tibet Autonomous Region. Things seem to be stricter, and in some ways, Naba seemed almost more Tibetan to me. It wasn't, quite as overrun by Chinese businesses. I mean, there are a lot of Chinese businesses, but there weren't very many Chinese tourists. The regulations for foreigners in Lhasa and Central Tibet are very strict. Anywhere you drive, there's a checkpoint. You have to register with the police. Any place you go, there are surveillance cameras everywhere. I mean, there are in Naba too, but it doesn't seem quite as stifling. And, I think up to, maybe like the early 2000s, there was much more intellectual and religious freedom in areas like Naba. And I think that's why Naba became kind of, sort of an intellectual center in its way. It was allowed to be more Tibetan than parts of the Tibet Autonomous Region.
When you're in Naba itself, do you see the presence of the Chinese authorities around you, or like how, I think for people who aren't in these Tibetan areas, they might have certain visions of sort of how China maintains its control over them. Just wondering what.
Just everywhere. I mean, the first time I went into the center of Naba in 2013, when there was still a lot of self-immolations, I mean, every other car was some kind of government car, and there were, armored personnel carriers and police cars and these, khaki military trucks and various kinds of military hardware, checkpoints. It was pretty overwhelming. And in fact, that trip, I thought I would get out and do some interviews, but I thought, no, this is really a bad idea. And I got out my phone, I was going to take some photos, and I thought, that's a bad idea too. I got a little braver on other trips.
There's a question here from Anthony De Palma, who's a longtime New York Times foreign correspondent, and his question reflects the concerns of foreign correspondents. So he asks, were Tibetans at all concerned about repercussions for speaking to you? And did some of them turn you down because of that? And then how did relying on translators help or hurt your reporting process?
Good questions. I think Anthony had some of the same issues reporting on Cuba, if I'm not mistaken. I found that high-ranking Tibetans were very frightened to talk to me, terrified. Anybody who was an academic, a government official, even students at the more elite universities who had, much to lose, were very, very frightened. Ordinary people, nomads, regular business people, sort of lower level non-party members, were not so intimidated. They were actually extremely friendly. And the language issue was quite difficult. On some trips, I traveled with a Tibetan, but that turned out to be just too frightening, because there's always this problem for foreign correspondents. If we're caught, I was an accredited journalist, I would just be sent back to Beijing. Nothing would happen to me. But a Tibetan who was working with me would really get in serious trouble. So I ended up usually traveling, if I was traveling with an assistant or a translator, I would travel with somebody Chinese. And actually once when I was traveling with a Chinese news assistant, he got terrible altitude sickness, and I had to work in Chinese. And that was very limiting, both because my Chinese wasn't very good. A lot of the people I was interviewing, their Chinese was not good. One technique that I used is I would, interview people in Chinese, my broken Chinese, their broken Chinese, and then I would say, say it again in Tibetan, and I would tape it. And sometimes they would just talk for 30 minutes, and then I'd have it translated later.
Mm. Did you have sort of Tibetan researchers who were helping you outside of, when you were back in Beijing or when you were working on the book in other places?
I usually sent the tapes, the audio, outside of China. Mm-hmm. There were plenty of people who could translate it, but right. It's a tricky thing, because there are people who would have liked to work with me, but it was just too risky for mm-hmm. them. And, by the end, I also started using Chinese drivers, and that was terribly discriminatory, but it was just easier for them. I mean, China is very controlled, and the Han Chinese population is controlled, but, anything that the Han Chinese have so much more leeway than ethnic minorities. So, they're just not as scared, because they can get away with a lot more.
Right. I had my own personal experience where police stopped me and colleagues, and they questioned our Tibetan driver for a long time, overnight in a police station. So I understand that concern. Yeah. Krista asks, was there a difference between the interviews you conducted inside and outside Naba and the Tibetan regions, and the views and then outside of China, the Chinese borders, in the exile communities? And then was there a difference in the views that people expressed in both places? Yeah,
that's an interesting question. sometimes the people who were inside, because I did have a lot of lengthy conversations with Tibetans who were still living in Tibet. You know, maybe because they have to live under the system, I think were a little bit more accepting of the Chinese Communist Party. They would say, you know, this is good, but that's bad. People living in exile, especially if they've been in exile a long time, you know, tend to be more militantly opposed. And I mean, I found this is true interviewing refugees and defectors from many, many places. The people living inside, as I said, that, you know, you never knew how honestly they were speaking, because sometimes they say, oh, I really like the party. People would often praise Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, saying he's done so much to fight corruption, but then they would go on. I mean, I think the takeaway I had from the people living inside Tibet was that they were appreciative of some of the economic advances, but that they wanted, you know, their freedoms. They wanted, the people who were more pro-Chinese were like, okay, I'll accept it. This is not a Western democracy. You know, I don't have the same freedom of speech, but I still want to, you know, be able to speak my language, educate my children the way I want. I want a passport. You know, I'm watching these Chinese people who are going to Thailand for vacation and going to France. And, you know, I want the same thing. I want, if they want us to be Chinese, they should give us the same privileges that the Chinese have. And there's a businessman who's quoted in the last chapter who said to me, I have everything I want in life except my freedom. And he was, you know, had done very well, had an SUV and a couple of apartments, and, you know, was really, you know, prospering, and, you know, not particularly militant, but he also didn't have a passport and felt like, what's the point of, you know, having money if I can't travel the way other Chinese citizens travel.
Right. And I remember when I first arrived in Beijing, 2000, it was right after the uprising on Tibetan Plateau. So we were being bombarded by Chinese officials with other propaganda on Tibet. We were getting all these like white papers that have been written by the government and things like that. And how do you articulate what the Chinese official viewpoint is on, you know, what they've done with Tibet and on their rationale for their governance of Tibet?
Well, I mean, the Chinese will say truthfully that they've invested a lot of money in Tibet. They've built a lot of infrastructure. They've built all these airports. They built the railroad to Lhasa. But that infrastructure is basically designed for Han Chinese in Tibet. And actually, a lot of Tibetans can't use those airports or those trains because they don't have the right kind of documentation. They don't have proper identity cards. It's not, you know, it's not a big document culture. So they've been, you know, so often cut off from the development. And you see this everywhere around Naba. You'll see like there, you know, some beautiful new houses that are being built, and the advertisements are all in Chinese, and those are designed for Chinese people. And then there's these houses that are designed for the Tibetans to be resettled, and they're just, you know, mud shells, you know, with no amenities at all. And I mean, the Chinese are bringing, you know, more Han Chinese into the Tibetan areas. I mean, I shouldn't say the Chinese government is always bringing them. Sometimes they're just bringing themselves. But Han Chinese have moved in from, especially from Sichuan, you know, throughout the Tibetan Plateau and taken over the businesses and, you know, leaving the Tibetans a minority. And it's, you know, it's very interesting if you go and talk to some of these construction crews, they're almost all Chinese. Those jobs go to Chinese people, they don't go to Tibetans. So it's like, yeah, they're investing money, but for who? And I mean, I noticed this when I was in Lhasa, I flew Tibet Airways. And Tibet Airways, I mean, the airline magazine is in Chinese and English. There's no Tibetan in it. There's like decorative Tibetan calligraphy on the cover. The public maps were in Chinese, sometimes English. The airport Burger King has like a menu in Chinese and English. They're just, it's not designed, the new stuff is just not designed for Tibetans. So yeah, there's development, but development for whom?
There's an audience member, Yangchen Dokar, which so the audience member might be Tibetan, asks, I'm surprised to hear you say that Tibetans in this region embrace socialism, given the fact that there were so many self-immolations there. So how do you explain that contradiction in terms of some of the viewpoints you heard about socialism and the Chinese government, and then the fact that this was the epicenter of self-immolations?
I think they embrace, some of the ideas of socialism. In fact, that's true of the Dalai Lama too. I mean, the Dalai Lama has said in many interviews, he said to me as well, that he considered himself a socialist, that he believed a lot of the teachings of Karl Marx. As I said, some of the messages about equal distribution of wealth mesh very nicely with Tibetan Buddhism. What they don't like is the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party is basically the only thing communist about it is the name communist. They don't like the party rule. They don't like one party rule, but some of the ideas were very appealing to Tibetans, especially Tibetan intellectuals, in a period until they saw that they weren't really being implemented.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything more you can tell us about the self-immolations and how that began? I mean, I think the first one's in 2009, and then there was a bit of a lag, and then there were many more after that. Like, can you tell us a little bit more about what set that off?
I mean, I think there were several, to some extent, they were copycat cases. One inspired another. But I think they were, mostly a cry for attention. Like, look at us, we're suffering. And, I've been thinking lately, I was just reading about John Lewis, some of the ideas about redemptive suffering that came out of the civil rights movement. And a lot of that was that they would redeem themselves through their suffering. And I guess it was different with different people. There was one man whose case I covered, who I found very interesting. He was part of a WeChat group. WeChat is the main texting function that was dedicated to nonviolence. And he was in a dispute with a neighbor, and he thought, I could, I'm so angry, I could kill this neighbor, but I don't want to do that because I really believe in nonviolence. So I'll kill myself again instead and make it a statement to nonviolence. And it was, very, inward focused, to show that you would make this sacrifice for Tibet rather than harming somebody else. And I mean, I think they knew that there was no point in trying to fight the Chinese government. That would be a losing cause. That they felt like they could do more through self-immolation.
I remember a lot of those videos got out via the Tibetan exile community. They would get from the Tibetan plateau to people in Dharamsala, who would then sort of show them to journalists and others.
Yeah, and in Dharamsala, there is, sort of there was actually last I was there, sort of a cult of the self-immolators. There's banners and posters with their photos. And I think a lot of the Tibetans, both inside Tibet and in exile, were very ambivalent. They didn't want people killing themselves, especially when some of the self-immolators were, mothers with kids and people who had family responsibility. But they were still kind of inspired by their courage. And I mean, that was, that was true of the Dalai Lama himself. He would say like, well, I don't support this, but I don't condemn it because I don't want to offend these people. There were a lot of contradictory emotions.
So a couple of audience members bring up what's an inevitable question given the prominence of Xinjiang in the headlines today, which is, for audience members who aren't familiar with this, Xinjiang's a region in Western China, north of the Tibetan plateau, where the Chinese government in recent years has set up internment camps for ethnic minorities who are Muslims, mostly Uyghurs, but also Kazakhs and others. And they've been putting these ethnic minorities in those camps, and some have remained there for years. So these audience members ask you, Barbara, what are the parallels you've seen between what has happened on the Tibetan Plateau and what's going on in Xinjiang now? And I think one data point we should tell the audience members is that the party chief in Xinjiang now is Chen Chuanguo, who used to run the Tibet Autonomous Region.
Yeah, and some of the measures used in Xinjiang were sort of tried out in very limited form in Tibet. I mean, there's no doubt that what's happening in Xinjiang is much harsher than anything happening in Tibet at the moment. And I'll say at the moment because there have been different phases in the history of modern China. Their situations are quite parallel, and these are ethnic minorities who are not Chinese. Their language is unrelated to Chinese. They're ethnically not really related to the Chinese. Their religion, their culture, their food, everything is different. And they live on a large piece of China. I mean, I always say to sort of non-China heads, like, get out your map of China and, look, I mean, most of the landmass of China, or at least half, is Xinjiang in the northwest and the Tibetan plateau. I'm saying the parts of China that are in the plateau, if not Tibet autonomous region. And, the China that we think of as China is really like the Northeast Corridor. It's like the Northeast Corridor going from Boston down to Florida and maybe, as far as Chicago, maybe Denver in a pinch, but, it's all sort of squeezed into the East. And so, for the Chinese government, control over these areas, which are largely not Chinese in character, at least some point in their recent history, were not Chinese in character, is very important. And they're trying everything to assert that control. It's interesting because the Tibetans and the Uyghurs don't have all that much to do with each other. And although they live close, there's mountains and a desert that separate them. And, there is a history of Muslim Buddhist tension in that region. But, certainly intellectuals will see that it's part of the same.
Right. And this is a good question, follow up on that from John. And he asks, I'll paraphrase a bit, because of the violence against monks and also repressive actions by the Chinese government against people of various, ethnic minorities, do you see a growing need for the type of in-depth reporting and research you've done in this book into sort of China, into various ethnic minority communities, and sort of in a way it's documenting a heritage that's being lost?
That's kind of a softball question, John, but yes. I mean, the reporters need to do more in Western China. And I mean, New York Times has done great work in Xinjiang, as have others. It's really, really hard to report in these places. I mean, the degree of difficulty of just, getting there, getting people to talk to us, verifying what they say, making sure the people who talk to us don't get in trouble. It's really difficult, but yes, we need more reporting, and especially from Western China. I mean, I think the journalists have discussed this among themselves, that the press corps is all based in Beijing, a few in Shanghai. I don't know of anybody, any staff that have had a bureau for any length of time in Western China. I don't know, and maybe you do, Ed.
Well, one of our, someone we know, Craig Simons, who's now a diplomat, was a journalist in Chongqing for a while for Newsweek, I think.
Yeah, but I think he was freelance at the time.
Right. And one person who works on Tibet issues, Mateo, asks, have you ever been tried applying for a permit to go to the Central Tibet, the Tibet Autonomous Region, report there?
I did try many times when I was a journalist, and I never got one. I was never on the invited trips. And I did go to the Tibet Autonomous Region as a tourist after I left. And, you know, I mean, we follow the rules, so I didn't report on that trip because I was on a tourist permit. Well, you could ask Ed more about that because you were lucky enough to get on one of these trips.
Oh yeah, in 2000, I think 2010, I went on one of these government-sponsored trips, and it's sort of one of these Potemkin village trips where they show you what they went about, sort of model villages and things like that. So, Laura asks, what's the most surprising part of your research, and has the writing process changed between your books?
When I did my North Korea book, Nothing to Envy, I hadn't really done a book like that before. And it was very hard to go from being a journalist to being a storyteller. And when you write a book, especially narrative nonfiction, it's it's more drawn out, and the whole writing technique is very different. And it really took me a long time to get it. But I felt like my first book about Sarajevo was still, written like a collection of newspaper columns. I think I've been, I mentioned this before, memory. I found it very interesting how people process their memories and what they remember. And on the North Korea book, again, there were very important things that people didn't remember, but sometimes they could tell you like the shadows on somebody's face and the lighting. And I think in this kind of writing, you sort of have to follow the people you're writing about and let them tell their stories and not assume that this is what they're going to say, because again, people's emotions are often, much more nuanced than you expect. And so on my, I think in my more recent reporting, maybe I got lazier. I just would let people talk, and I always felt a little bit more like a psychiatrist, because most people, when you come down to it, like to talk about themselves. And the Tibetans I interviewed, some of them had really suffered a lot, and their families had suffered a lot, and nobody had really talked to them about it or listened to them. And, this is certainly, true of older Tibetans who lived through this horrible period of 1958, which was, 1958, it was like the Dulak, that's the expression they use. It's like when the sky fell, and it was just, their whole world crashed. And, there's still a lot of trauma that runs through the Tibetan population over things that happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And, this is a point I make because, Han Chinese suffered a lot too. And there's a whole, what we call scar literature of things that happened during the Great Leap Forward and the cultural evolution. But for everything that was done to Han Chinese, and some of it was very bad, more happened to Tibetans. It was that much worse.
And I'll take a couple more questions before we wrap up. So this one's from another John in the audience. In your career as a foreign correspondent, do you develop a greater affinity for one place over another? And did that influence your decision on whether to write a book on a particular place?
Yes, that's true. And, I would say from the moment I set foot on the Tibetan plateau, which was 2008, right after the protests began, I knew I was going to write my next book about Tibet. And, I can't even explain it. Was it the scenery, the food? Actually, I never developed an affinity for Tibetan food, and I kind of failed on the language, which is quite difficult, much harder than Chinese. But I think it was the complexity of the history and people's spirituality, and I don't know. I can't even figure it out, but I was hooked pretty instantly.
I think this is a good question to end on. Jane asked, can you describe the meaning behind the title of the book? It's definitely an intriguing title.
Eat the Buddha. Well,
right.
It's a little bit provocative. During the Long March period, the Long March was, basically the flight of the Red Army during the Chinese Civil War from the nationalists. The Red Army, these early communists, fled west into the Tibetan plateau, trying to escape. And when they got to the Tibetan plateau, first of all, they had no idea where they were. They thought, it's very otherworldly. They thought they had left China, that they had somehow were in heaven or hell, or it was just, so different. But they didn't have enough provisions with them. And so they started, basically looting Tibetan homes and Tibetan monasteries. And I mean, some of them were very idealistic socialists, and they felt bad about this, and they wrote IOUs and promised to repay the debt, but they were starving. And they went into the monasteries, and there were a lot of figurines in the Tibetan monasteries that are made of barley flour and butter. And they ate these statues. And this actually came from a memoir written by a Chinese soldier who felt bad about this, but said, it was like we were eating the Buddha. And that was the title I used. I didn't coin the expression. A British Tibetologist, whose name is Matthew Ackister, who wrote a lot about the Long March, along with a Chinese Tibetologist, Li Jianlin, did a paper called Eat the Buddha about what happened in the 1930s. And I asked for their permission to use this title, but it was, symbolic because Naba was one of the first places where Chinese communists and Tibetans encountered one another. And, obviously it didn't go well, and it, set the stage for what has happened since.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks a lot, Barbara. It's an amazing book, and I encourage everyone to set aside a lot of time to enjoy it. So is there any final words you want to say about the book or your experience working on it?
I'm glad it's out. I mean, it was a very long haul. It was a difficult book in terms of, traveling to the place, doing the interviews, writing. I think really it was sort of in process a lot of the last decade, and was a bit of a work of obsession.
Right. Well, thanks for bringing it to us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Politics and Prose for keeping us, reading and talking and listening to each other during the lockdown.
Right. Okay. Thanks.